everyone. Again, my name is Paige Arthur. I'm the Deputy Director at the Center on International Cooperation at NYU. I'm very happy to be here virtually at the Stockholm Forum. Of course, it's always better to be in person, and we certainly miss it this year, but really grateful for the chance to connect with you and to put together this panel, which we're calling Friend or Foe, and it is about emerging technologies and conflict early warning in this age of compound risk, which is of course what we're talking about at the Stockholm Forum this year. So let's first acknowledge that the risks are great and that they are transforming. And the emphasis on early warning is as relevant now as it has ever been. But as the COVID crisis has shown us, and as this forum has stressed, risks are multidimensional and they create cascading effects. So what started out as a health crisis has created economic and social crises, which can then cascade into political and peace-building crises. And we shouldn't underestimate the gravity of the situation. As Susan Cutter has observed, cascades occur as a consequence of the loss of capacity in one system, overwhelming a connected system, elevating the impacts from hazard to disaster to catastrophe. So where do emerging data-driven technologies fit into this highly dynamic landscape? It's important to note that data-driven approaches are not new. Efforts to gather data in order to better understand where conflicts might arise go back decades, if not farther. But there is something new in this moment. And first, there's a qualitative change in the data available in terms of scale of the data, velocity of the data, and availability of data. And second, there's been a quantum leap in methods. And this includes new methods to detect patterns within large volumes of data, often through using machine learning techniques, as well as advances in data science relating to predictive modeling, as well as other advances. In spite of these advances, though, I would suggest we're really still in the beginning stages of a process to really decipher which data is meaningful and when. So the goal of this short session is to give you a sense of the creative opportunities that exist for deepening the use of data-driven approaches, not just to address risks, but also to generate practical solutions to real problems that people working on peace building and violence prevention may face. And indeed, these data-driven technologies such as machine learning, natural language processing, artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, and so forth are incredible tools that open vast new horizons for peacebuilding actors. But the problem we found is that peacebuilding actors often just don't know how to harness them. And they would benefit not just from better capacity, but a stronger connection to people with a different set of skills. So our panelists are at the forefront of a new direction in the field. One uses state-of-the-art predictive modeling and a wide variety of data sets to assess emerging risks. Another combines remote sensing in conflict settings with artificial intelligence to warn of impending harms. And another analyzes the interaction between climate and political risk. So we hope that through highlighting their work, we can spark some further creative ideas for collaboration. My organization, the Center on International Cooperation, has been working for the past year to build a community of practice around data for peace building and prevention. And I'm happy that Branka Panic, who's been our partner on that, is here to talk about that as well today. So we're bringing together a wide range of actors from academia, non-governmental organizations, governments, multilaterals, the private sector, all through convenings like this one. And I want to say thank you to the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who's been supporting this initiative. So if this event speaks to you, I'm also going to invite you to an upcoming virtual workshop we have on early warning, early action, which is coming up later this month. But more on that later. Let's turn to our panel now. And I'm very happy to welcome first Chris Mahoney, who's the CEO and co-founder of Peloria. So Chris, you have developed this idea for Peloria over the past few years. Where did the idea come from, and what makes Peloria's approach distinctive when it comes to early assessment of risk? Over to you.
Thank you, Paige. Thanks, Branka. Thank you to NYU, to the Center on International Cooperation, to your supporters, the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of course, to CIPRI and the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs for their support of this important conference and the opportunity to share what we're doing, but more importantly, to learn from also from our co-panelists and yourselves, and hopefully some critique from the audience as to how we go about what we do. What we do came about as a consequence of the Pathways for Peace process, which was a joint report between the United Nations and the World Bank, the first time they'd sort of published anything jointly really on international peace and security. And part of my portfolio as part of the team working on that report was to identify knowledge gaps that we have in identifying factors that exaggerate or mitigate risk of violent conflict. And so I was bringing a number of actors to New York to present their approaches. And one of those actors had spent sort of half a decade focusing on the leveraging of large language data sets. He's had special access with Recorded Future, but was at the same time an anthropologist. So was not necessarily a data scientist, but was able to come to this sphere from through a multidisciplinary lens, which was very endearing to us. And we then went about exploring a hypothesis that that we're jointly developed, which is that by integrating multidisciplinary social science expertise into data selection, data curation, data modeling, we would then be in a position to dramatically enhance the predictive accuracy, geographic specificity, look-ahead periods of early warning capability when it comes to social phenomena. And so we did that. We achieved 85% accuracy over a sort of a 100 to 120 day look-ahead period in a model that we developed. And then when touring that model to different ministries of foreign affairs, OECD, and here in Washington, DC, to colleagues at State Department, and then colleagues over at the Department of Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is where they referred us to someone they believed was doing cutting edge work at the United States Institute of Peace. That was their chief data scientist, Professor Rohini Shrihari. And we went and shared our approach with her, and that began a conversation that led to Rohini joining us in co-founding Peloria. So that's where Peloria came from. She is a data scientist. My background is in law and political economy, and we have an anthropologist also as our co-founder. We're now bringing on one of the co-authors of the IPCC's Africa chapter. He's as our lead on what we call natural world phenomena, and we have a number of research associates and data scientists and software engineers now delivering models across different continents. Then what I'll do perhaps is just very quickly give you an example perhaps of what we do. If I'm able to share my screen here, if I could trouble the moderator to enable that. I'll quickly tour you through one of our models where we in effect use data representing real phenomena and what we call the natural. So that's all your environmental data, everything from temperature, rainfall, soil moisture, to satellite generated imagery data, which will tell you a lot about the greenness or not of shrubbery, but also tells you about what we call built world data, which is the number, size, nature of structures, of transport infrastructure, and then social world data. So that's everything from demography to human events, whether they be political, whether they be violence events themselves, and then of course the economic data, everything from macro fiscal indicators to business data, to commodity prices, and those phenomena. So that is how we're able to first develop a picture of what's happening in reality, right? But then, of course, it's not just reality that drives human behavior. So we also draw on data that indicates perception of that reality. So accompanying the data representing change in the natural, social, and built world, we also collect data representing language sentiment about the phenomena in the natural, built, and social world from online language news, from social media. Now we're also able to do this from audio, where we transcribe that audio to text, and we also gather the data representing the tone of the enunciation of that audio. So here, for example, is a model we commonly tour, developed for a development actor, where, say, for example, on August 16th of last year, we predict, and then in advance of the questions around the ethics of what we do, I've taken us right back so that I'm not providing to the audience the current predictions of change in levels of violence. But here we predict 3 different forms of violence across 4 territories: all of Kenya, the Rift Valley region, the coastal region, and the capital region. So I can change this to riots and protests. You'll see the optimal look ahead period, which is what it will automatically go to, is 120 days. We have an accuracy of 98%. It will tell you how many events we would predict in that 120 days, the number of events that occurred in the preceding same number of days. I can change this to 75 days if that is the period of time in which this development actor wishes to roll out a development project, or for some other reason that's their interest, and it will change. It will give you that level of accuracy and the number of events forecast over that number of days. I can change it to the capital region of Kenya, and again, it will give you the level of accuracy, the number of events in the preceding same number of days. And then it's accountable. So you can change the date, and you can see to what extent we got it right or to what extent we got it wrong, either by coming to the analytics page, and it will break down for you the number of events, of the different types of violence events in the different territories, broken down to the day. And you can scroll in and out temporally to see week to week. And then you can come and see, for example, change in language sentiment, both positive sentiment, negative sentiment, and the volume of language sentiment about all these different topics that are commonly associated with change in levels of violence in Kenya, for example, right? So this gives a client a broad overview. We can weave in visualizations, key events, whether they be religious, whether they be the selection of political candidates for political parties, actual elections themselves, sporting events as well. For example, we're developing a model for Chennai, and we find that sentiment, for example, there may change dramatically based on whether the Chennai Super Kings cricket team wins or loses, right? And negative or positive sentiment about availability of water, about air quality, those things haven't changed in reality, but negative sentiment after a Chennai Super Kings cricket team loss has increased significantly. So we can see those things. We can also see under what changes in configuration of reality those factors increase or decrease, and what most importantly that means for this kind of early warning approach is that it's not just that we're predicting. What's even more important is that we're engaged in explainable AI, right? So we can identify the factors, the configuration of factors in reality and perceptions of them most associated with change in levels of violence. And this just gives you an insight into just one of those, right? Where I can select in descending order. I can have the machine learning algorithm identify the tweets whose sentiment is most associated with increase or decrease in violence. Right? And of course, we can do this across the different sources of online language data, whether it's online news, other social media sources. But I can look for just negative sentiment, and just negative sentiment by a number of influential actors, right, in Kenya across business leadership, social leadership, including religious leadership, political leadership. You'll have all your politicians in there, and I could select just a number of only negative sentiment by all actors. I left it on all, just about those topics, and I click submit, and it will rank from top to the very, 3 or 4 millionth tweet, whose negative language sentiment about those topics is associated with change and violence. Then we can go do an even deeper dive to see under what configurations of change in temperature, rainfall, the price of fuel, the price of maize or rice, all these other configurations of change in reality, this language sentiment has an even greater or smaller relationship to change, and whatever the dependent variable is, right? It's just not just violence, but we also forecast social unrest related disruption of road and rail, social unrest, also change in levels of poverty. And that's really what enables us to advance our mission, which is to bring government, civil society, and the private sector together around around evidence-based approaches to inclusive, just, and resilient societies.
So that's great, Chris. I think that's a wonderful overview of this. And for me, I think what's really fantastic is it shows a kind of a really creative approach that that emerged out of this bureaucratic, process, which was the Pathways for Peace report, and that collaboration between the bank and the UN, and the learning that happened from that. And then people going off creatively and putting together partnerships to kind of develop a new reality. But the different kind of data sets that you employ, social, economic, environmental, along with perception data, I think is really innovative. So thanks very much. And we're going to come back in the discussion questions as well. But let's move on next to Dan Henneberry, who's the Director of Analytics for HALA Systems. And Dan, HALA Systems has been a recognized leader in the use of remote sensing for civilian protection in some of the most difficult contexts in the world. And of course, I think many people know about your work in Syria, which has been much covered in the news. But tell us more about HALA Systems works and about some of your most important projects right now.
Of course. Thank you very much, Dr. Arthur. As you say, I'm HALA's Director of Analytics. I'm a data scientist by training, and before that, I worked in government and in the private sector for a number of years. The broad offering of HALA is this system called Sentry. I say a system; it's really a system of systems. Its purpose is broadly to efficiently gather data from a number of sources. And then find ways to either put that into the hands of civilians who can then, take action to, save their own lives and to live more productive lives, or to support organizations that themselves are working in the interest of improving civilian well-being. So as you say, the primary sort of the flagship deployment of Sentry is the early warning system in Syria. So of course, for those not familiar, we support the Syrian civil defense. We run an airstrike early warning system in northwest Syria. Observers on the ground, combined with some other data sources, track the movement of aircraft, and then push that information forward to civilians through one of a number of warning channels. That started off with just social media on your phone, but fairly quickly snowballed into other warning channels, including being read over the radio, to air raid sirens that are connected and can be remotely turned on, and then even most recently to warning lights that we've worked with schools and hospitals in northwest Syria to install, which give just a kind of a running situational awareness of the skies around the facility at any given time. Our challenges going forward, like our next projects that you ask about, it's life as a startup. It's difficult for me to speak with authority about what we will necessarily be doing next year. Certainly the ones that seem to have the most promise right now are the ones I can talk the least about. But what I will say is that our primary concern as we want to move outside of Syria and begin to work in some other contexts is that we need to broaden the scope of this system. Certainly it is very useful to have information on aircraft moving around, but in order to be truly useful in general purpose, our challenge has been to find ways that this can be used to conflict generally. Certainly no one is attempting to be subtle when they're flying around a war zone in a multi-ton screaming war machine. So we're working to implement additional data sources. Depending on context, the observer network that we rely heavily on may not be able to have as live a connection with us as possible. So we're working to find ways to empower observers who are far away from the internet that we all kind of take for granted. We're working on ways to implement more remote sensing technologies that can be more rapidly rolled out in areas where infrastructure is limited. So satellite imagery, but also very inexpensive sensors. And then, finally, we're branching out, looking to find organizations that are working, already working, sometimes even with observer networks already, to find out how we can integrate ourselves into what they're doing and then become basically a technology partner to enhance and amplify the work that they're already doing. To give sort of a very tentative example that actually was on a call I just came from, we're looking at a pilot project in Darfur. And here, this pilot project would be looking at several specific sensitive sites that are important to refugees and finding ways to offer warnings to them. And this is in one way very similar to work we've already done, but of course it will require some of the sort of evolution that I spoke to a bit earlier. And so I think that's it. I had a whole bunch of other notes on how the system's been working and being perceived, but I think that's a good amount of time, so I'll turn it back over. Thank you.
Great. I'm sure we'll come to some of that in the discussion. And also just want to invite people to start putting questions into the Q&A box. That's available, and we will have time for discussion with these folks. But I think, Dan, I think what you say really demonstrates the complexity of what you're trying to achieve, combining different data sources, from the remote sensing to satellite imagery, but of course there's always the human element and observer networks. And so I think it's really important to keep the kind of ground level data that's really important, keep that in mind in these discussions. So with that, I would like to turn to Adriana Abdenur, who's the Executive Director of Plataforma Sipo. And Adriana, you are an incredibly eloquent voice in global advocacy around climate and political risk. How has Plataforma Sipo played such a key role, and what are you working on now?
Thank you very much, Paige. Thank you, Branca. It's lovely to be back in touch and to be a part of this conversation. We at CIPÓ believe it's very important to include more Global South voices in the debates and also the innovations about data and emerging technologies. So I'm very happy to be here with you. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing and what we're focusing on in the data area right now. CIPÓ is an independent, it's women-led institute based here in Brazil, dedicated to the intersection of climate, governance, and peace. And we have right now staff based in 3 different biomes around Brazil, the Amazon, the Cerrado, which is the savanna part, and the Atlantic forest. And as part of our work, we analyze climate risks, especially in the Amazon basin, but we also look very closely at environmental degradation due to environmental crimes, such as illegal land invasions, forest fires, illegal logging, and illegal gold mining. And of course, there are patterns of other types of crime and of violence and conflict even that are associated with the predatory use of natural resources. So we work very much at that intersection between environmental crime and violence. And in one of our major projects right now, we support the public ministry here in Brazil to improve its investigative methods to curb environmental crimes. And this includes, by the way, one topic that's very dear to our hearts, which is the attacks and assassination of environmental defenders in the Amazon basin, not just the Brazilian Amazon, but Amazon-wide. And the public ministry here in Brazil, it works very closely with civil society and in some instances with the private sector to identify environmental degradation hotspots and of course to prosecute those responsible, but also to develop extrajudicial solutions in the positive way. And what happens is that there is a major glut of data primarily because of the availability of satellite imagery, which has improved by leaps and bounds, and associated georeference data. But at the same time, there are major gaps, especially when it comes to capacity to filter, to process, and to analyze, and to cross-reference with other data sources as well as qualitative analysis. So that's where Plataforma CIPÓ comes in, since many of us have either a data background or a qualitative research background. We carry out analyses of different data, emerging data sources and technologies, and issue recommendations as to how these can be better incorporated, for example, by the public ministry in addressing the ecological crisis here in Brazil. And so we're very much interested in tracking changes in land use, including environmental degradation, but also infrastructure construction, which is undergoing a major boom here in the region, especially with the entrance of Chinese projects. And I'll give you very briefly, two examples of emerging technologies that we track and disseminate, and two emerging data sources. So the first one is the use of satellite imagery and associated algorithms to detect and even predict changing land use. And this includes, for instance, illegal deforestation and gold mining in the Amazon. There is a methodology that was developed by a São Paulo NGO called Biomas. And this methodology serves primarily for tracking, but as I said, there is some predictive capacity that's being explored through collaboration with other organizations, since the patterns and the rates of deforestation that we see in the Amazon basin are, they vary according to the cause. And of course, they are typically indicative of an imminent uptick in environmental degradation, but also in violence. So it's very possible to carry out this analysis in a very fine-grained way. And for instance, by feeding now algorithms, by feeding the algorithms more data on artisanal gold mining or illegal gold digging, as we're now calling it, we see that the footprints of that particular type of activity looks very different in the pixelation than industrial mining, although of course there are also environmental crimes associated with industrial mining. And these are activities that literally open up space for all types of criminal actions and for violence. The second example, Branca and Paige have already heard a little bit about this, is the use of audio connection. So this is also done in association with artificial intelligence in order to detect illegal activities in the rainforest areas. And in some instances, it entails the distribution of cell phones and devices to detect, for instance, the noise of chainsaws in the forest or explosive material that's associated with types of illegal gold mining. And the data is automatically uploaded to the cloud for AI-based analysis. And so this is being used at an experimental level, but there is a bit of potential, especially once the pandemic is over, because of course now the Amazon has been incredibly heavily affected by the pandemic. And so access to these, this type of capillary access is very difficult to obtain right now. In terms of emerging sources, just to mention two very briefly. First, we're now following very closely planned infrastructure projects based on documents that we obtained through access laws. So, form the federal government. And we're looking, for instance, at a Chinese railway that's set to cross most of the Cerrado and the Amazon region, and that crosses through areas of high illegal deforestation where there's already a lot of propensity for conflict and violence. And the second and last point is that we're now following the money trail and looking at illegal financial flows that come out of environmental crimes and thus serve as an incentive for these activities, and working with different international actors to track money and gold laundering so that we also obtain data and track it backwards to try to detect where this is coming from. So these are just some of the examples of the kind of work that we're doing right now, especially in the Amazon. Thank you.
No, thank you to you, Adriana, for sharing those. I am amazed at the range of the work that you're doing and the different kinds of data methods that you're using and combining different data sources. I think you would have a lot to talk about with Dan, actually, at Health Systems and some of your projects, as well as with Chris. So I'm really glad that we were able to connect all of you on this panel. I'd like to end these kind of presentations with Branka Panic, who's our visiting fellow at CIC, but who's also the founder and executive director of AI for Peace. And, you know, Branka, you, last fall, we were very pleased to have been working you over this past year. And last fall, you developed a mapping of the ecosystem of organizations and people working on data-driven approaches to peace and prevention. I wonder if you can highlight some of the most important risks that we found from that particular report.
Thank you, Paige, and it's such a pleasure to be here and to talk about this work that I've done. We actually started doing this work in the midst of pandemic, which I think it's really interesting to showcase this mapping happening in the midst of one of the prime examples of compound risks. So we actually were able to add a couple of questions when we were doing research to see how organizations are also tackling some of the challenges in their work coming from the pandemic itself. This work started almost a year ago, and then the part of this work was finalized in October when we published a report by NYU CIC that mapped different organizations and projects that are mobilizing data and utilizing data-driven approaches to strengthen peace building and conflict prevention work. And I interviewed over 30 of these organizations and experts, and our idea was to shed light to some of the examples and potential positive impacts of these technologies. And we are super lucky, as Paige said, to have our guests today actually talking firsthand about some of these cutting edge examples. But another central topic of these conversations and these interviews was around not only opportunities, but also risks. And this is another dimension to conversation that I want to bring. So we heard how organizations and our guests are looking into risks to forecasting conflict or violence or environmental degradation. But there is another level of risk coming into this work when we are applying new data-driven approaches of different ethical constraints. And this is where this topic relates to friend or foe. So we believe that we really need to ask this question over and over again. And so often in these conversations that we had through this work, we saw a sort of a paradox in applying some of these approaches in peace building and prevention, probably because of this specific context that we as peace builders are working in. So I'll explain in a couple of points what is this paradox about. So one of the general comments of peace builders was this challenge of data, and we already heard our guests talking about this. So this can come as a challenge of lack of data, or this can come as a challenge of lack of quality of data. So in a majority of conversations that we had, and then especially not only in Global South, as Adriana pointed out, but in Global North as well, we often depend on data coming from national statistics offices, these open databases, or international agencies. So Chris worked for the World Bank. Usually this is this data being used. However, in many cases, this sources are simply not available. For many countries, they're not available, or they're not available in a good quality. So what we see is this potential of utilizing new technologies, including access to mobile phones, computers, internet, to maybe somehow fill this gap. And Paige mentioned in the introduction this change in scale, velocity, and availability. I think we are actually facing a change in what we actually perceive as data at all. So data is not only number anymore. And we see our guests how they are exploring this. So even exploring image, even exploring voice and text, and even sound to try to fill this gap of information that we are not having. What we also saw is this specific of conflict or post-conflict or violence settings. So this is another challenge to the work, where people usually, because of the security reasons, don't have a physical access to these spaces. So this can be a potential, at the same time, a risk to populations who are there, who can maybe serve as those who are providing those data, but also potential. So this is where the technology can come as a friend, offering these alternative resources. I want to bring back into discussion this point of observer network that Daniel mentioned. We really looked into this, trying to see how populations that provide information are impacted. Are there any additional risks? And we often saw this coming into conversation, about the security and safety risks that are out there, that although we see, of course, the benefits and potentials of advancing our work and seeing, getting signals of early warning, there is still this need to try to protect populations that are anyhow vulnerable and in danger. We often hear this, and I think this is not something that is specific for our field. It's across all fields and sectors where we are applying new data, lack of protection of personal information, even location of end users, of people who are data and communities who are data providers, collaborators. So what is different maybe in our sector is that this is not only a violation of digital rights. This is also a direct attack on their physical security and safety. I will just quickly mention a couple of more points that quite often, and wrap up, that quite often those risks are coming as unintended, but we do see a lot of cases when there is a data weaponization, so intentional use of this information to target facilities or members of a specific vulnerable group. I will finish with a quote that is my favorite one, that is in this report, that I actually took from Robert Kirkpatrick, the director of Global Pulse, who is saying that and this is another paradox that is coming to the place, that we in our community, while using data-driven approaches to peace and security, we really need to balance the risk of misuse against the risk of misuse of data. So we really need this. We need this tool. We need to fill the gaps. We need to empower our work through new technologies and these approaches, but we at the same time need to be aware of risks. So I'll stop here and happy to come back to discuss in details other points, and also looking forward to hear what our guests, how our guests are dealing with these topics in their own work. Thank you, Paige.
Thank you so much, Branka. And can you do me a favor and put a link to the mapping report in the chat so that people can access it if they want? And I'd like to, so I see we're starting to get questions in the question box. And so I'm going to gather those together. And some of them are already touching on the issues of some of the risks that Branka just mentioned. So I'd like to just talk with the panel briefly about some of the risks that they see, maybe even addressing some of these questions. So there are risks around mainly around data bias, around ethics that Branka raised. But whereas Branka did a very good job of laying out the various risks, maybe I can ask our speakers to talk about how they address them and deal with them in a positive way. So let me start with Chris and come to you about some of the risks that you've seen in your approach. And I see we've already gotten some questions in the chat about that and how you've addressed those.
Thanks, Paige. I was just trying to respond to a number of those questions, which were very well directed and very welcome. We obviously realize that there is enormous capacity for significant harm accompanying the technical competency that we're developing. And the even more concerning thing is that regulatory frameworks are not keeping up with the change in this technical capacity. And so therein lies a dearth or a void that we ourselves need as a small startup, right, need to expend our own time and resources to create those constraints. So we, one, have an internal process of identification of the risk, associating what we can do, identifying the optimal methods to constrain that risk in terms of mitigating the risk or managing the risk. And then we identify the level of risk that we can't manage and mitigate away and weigh that risk against the risk of not providing our capacity to be able to enable a positive contribution to society. So we really constrain what we provide and what we don't provide, agnostic to who we provide it to, because we don't have the capacity to make a determination about, oh, government X or government Y, you know, that these people are okay to engage with and these people are not. We're never going to be able to make that judgment. And so we really instead have to constrain what we do or what we don't do, depending on who the private sector, government, or civil society actor is. We don't take that approach. Instead, we are agnostic, and they will filter themselves out if they're not comfortable with the constraints that we impose on what we do and don't. Then we also have an ethics, rights, and governance oversight board that we're setting up. We're very fortunate to have some global pioneers across disciplines and experience assisting us with that, including Lord Robin Butler, Prince Zayed, former High Commissioner for Human Rights, Dr. Comfort Iro, the current Vice President of Crisis Group, and now Helen Clark, formerly head of UNDP and formerly Prime Minister of New Zealand, helping us to think these things through, because GDPR, other regulatory frameworks, as important as they are in taking steps forward, they're not sufficiently specific to this kind of technical capacity, right? There is so much that we could do within the bounds of the law, within the terms and conditions of others that could cause harm.
Thanks, Chris. And you also have a lot of very thoughtful comments in the chat. I definitely recommend people to read through those, because you went into great detail actually on some of the internal processes that you've set up at Peloria. Can I turn to Adriana next and ask really the same question? So, you know, maybe highlighting one of the risks that have been most significant for you and how you've tried to address that.
Sure. I mean, you know, there's one project that the public ministry created a program called Amazônia Protege, which uses satellite to automatically map polygons of 60 hectares or more that have been deforested. And the resolution of these images is incredibly high. But what happens is that even though the ministry is obliged to prosecute those carrying out the deforestation, they lack the personnel. So again, you have this glut of data, and it creates more problems because there's now a huge backlog. But I would say that the risk that concerns us the most really has to do with data privacy. The fact that there is this massive data being generated. It's incredibly high resolution. You can see a single tree, and the system can detect whether a single tree has been felled within the span of 24 hours. So if that at some point is crossed with individual level data, it's very concerning, because we're undergoing, of course, a process of further dehumanization, especially of indigenous and Afro-descending populations. And 80% of the population in the Amazon belongs to those two groups, within a context in which the federal government and the president himself have been working to criminalize civil society, especially civil society working on climate and environmental issues. They're trying, for instance, to revive a law from the dictatorship years on terrorism in order to designate organizations such as ours as terrorist organizations. And so you combine that with their efforts to silence the federal research institutions, such as the National Research Institution, which is what the one that manages the satellites and produces the data. And you create this very propitious environment for misuse of the kind of data that's being generated. So, I mean, obviously some of the solutions entail coming up with stronger norms and laws for protection of privacy at a local, but even at a collective level, especially with respect to protected communities within the Amazon.
Thanks very much, Adriana. Again, like a very thoughtful approach. And I see more questions coming into the Q&A. This last one here on data colonialism, which actually was also asked, I think referenced previously. So I might ask Dan to address that in his remarks now, but really the same question about a key risk for you, how you've addressed it in a positive way. And have you addressed the issue of data colonialism and the idea of sourcing from people who may not be participating in that sourcing explicitly?
Certainly. No, thank you, Dr. Arthur. To the exact thing that was being asked here about, is it not wrong to turn people into data subjects without their known consent as a commercial practice? We are sensitive to that. And so the first part of that known consent is basically we don't engage in that activity. Anyone contributing data to the system directly is doing that because they're working with us and is fully aware of how the data is being gathered and how it's being used. To the degree that any of our secondary data sources are sweeping up information that might be contain additional information that somebody might not want out there, we monitor the data sources for these. So your third-party data source is usually free of these, but open media data, just because it's out there on the internet, is risky. So we have these algorithms that look at it, and they only want the things that speak directly to the conflict in a way that is not specific to the civilians being affected by it. That's what they're looking for. That's what we audit the algorithms for. And we're sensitive to it. We haven't seen any case where that's popped up, but it's something we're worried about. And this is important, not just in the sense that this is the data colonialism is a real issue that we need to address. This also goes to physical security. The information like what I just described can be used to target people in very dangerous places. I would also point out that to the second piece of this, which is the commercial venture side, the other bit that we're sensitive to is that we do not want to be war profiteers. Like we would love it if we could go out of business because peace broke out someplace, and this is genuine, but we realize that that can be seen as a conflict of interest. And so the key ways we approach this are, one, we're trying to we always approach with the principle of first we do no harm, and we're here first for the benefit of the people that we're working with. And so that involves being open about how we're collecting the data, how the data is being used, making sure they have access to the data, and so forth. But it also for us means that we actually do spend a non-trivial amount of time working towards finding ways of supporting this this mission that isn't dependent on Western donors and other people who just feel like giving us money to do a good thing. And this, in the one sense, that means I'm not spending absolutely every minute, on this mission. But on the other hand, we think that this, frees us up from, that initial perceived conflict of interest that could arise.
Thanks so much, Dan. And thanks especially for saying the words "do no harm." When we're looking at the intersection of peace building, data-driven approaches, but also commercial enterprise, I think that kind of approach has to be at the center. Branka, were you coming in also to ask a question or make a comment?
I was just to make a quick comment, take you, Paige, just to follow up to what Dan said, and because this really came up as an important topic and the discussion in the report as well, the data colonialism issue. So just to add maybe on this, because we quite often are late. What is the critique to the peace building field? We are quite late to keep up with the technologies, but I do think we have a lot to contribute. As you said, the do no harm, like one of the principles that we contribute to the field. So similar is with the practices of data colonialism. So there is a pushback, so to say, of the movement that is advocating for digital data to be decolonized in line with ethical and then human rights frameworks. So this is this intersection of human rights field and the peace building field. And this topic is especially active with the indigenous communities. Adriana and I talked about this when we had an interview. This is really important topic in Latin America, across North America, Canada, Australia, and so on. And this is where we need to bring this discussion of data sovereignty and also self-determination of the data. So it's not about not using the data at all. It's about using it in a proper way to give an ownership to certain communities and groups so they can claim their own rights through this data. So this is one of the avenues that appeared as a sort of a solution or a next step in developing the field. So this is just a quick comment, and then maybe to give an intro for a new possible discussion, because I was picking comments and questions from the Q&A session, and I see that the issue of trust is coming in a lot of them, either directly or indirectly. So I think maybe this can be an interesting, just in a sentence or two, to hear from our speakers, how can they, as a very active organizations in this field, contribute to building trust. And we often see maybe big tech companies not doing the best work in this field. So what can your organizations do to help building trust and utilizing big data and data-driven approaches to peace building?
Great question, Branka. So why don't we start with Dan this time around and switch up the order a bit, and maybe do just a minute about trust, following Branka's question.
Certainly. So it's certainly trust is something we place a great deal of emphasis on. It is. I would be lying if I think I said that we have this figured out. It's definitely dependent situationally, and so you can go to different conflicts, and then if you can just talk with the wrong person, then all of a sudden there is kind of a pall cast on you in the efforts that you're trying to do. So I think we try to be very careful about who we work with. That especially extends to who we share data with, and so we're very careful about who our friends are. And as in reference to the previous question, we're constantly working with the local partners because they understand all of this far better than we do, and they will kind of clue us in and help us be responsible with that data.
Thanks, Dan. Chris.
Naturally, we have the same issue where I guess we take a different approach in the sense that we're always, I mean, objectivity is an impossibility, right? We're always going to have our own conscious or subconscious biases about what we think is the optimal approach, or who we think is making the best contribution to a difficult context. And so rather than being selective about who we engage with, where we constrain the potential of what we deliver and what we don't deliver, because we just don't have enough confidence in our own capacity to make those determinations. I mean, very much share the sentiment that Dan just expressed, which is, you know, there's no template for making determinations about who sort of, to be crude, good guys who are bad guys. And so, yeah, that's an enormous challenge, but we have this process for identifying risk and then identifying the optimal methods for managing and mitigating that risk. But just to come back really quickly to that point of the large entities, if you're talking about social media entities, you know, some of this capacity where we're able to identify language configurations, language phraseology, most associated with increase or decrease in violence, that may also be an objective metric that regulators can use in the future, right? To demand that there is some level of censorship, right? If the level of risk accompanying certain phraseology goes above 95%, 99%, right? There could be compelled a warning to accompany that language if it is posted on someone's platform. So it's that kind of technical capacity that could make a contribution in the future.
Thanks very much, Chris. And I'd like to give the final word to Adriana on the issue of trust and building trust.
Thank you, Paige. Well, right now in Brazil, we're operating in a context of extreme lack of trust, especially in institutions. I already mentioned the efforts to criminalize civil society, especially working on issues of disarmament and climate and environment. There is widespread dissemination of fake news, especially within the context of the pandemic. And we just learned this past week that the government has canceled the next census. So the non-production of capillary data contributes towards this context of lack of trust. And we believe that the solution to this is not within the technology itself, but rather through the construction or the building back better of policies that are firmly grounded in people's perceptions and local communities' needs, and that work to protect people and the forest rather than destroy both of them.
Adriana, I think that's actually the perfect way to end this session with that thought. I want to thank all of you. I'd like to thank the Stockholm Forum, Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and of course our supporter, the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Branka did just put into the chat, if this has sparked your interest in more, and I heard someone, or I saw someone in the Q&A say that a lot of this technology looks like rocket science. You know, how are we supposed to deal with it? We have a virtual week, a workshop coming up May 18th through 21st, just on early warning, early action, where we will be having these kinds of sessions, but also technical capacity building sessions on how to use some of these new technologies. So please do click on that link and register. Thanks again to everybody for joining us. We really appreciate your time.